I need to tell you something that happened to me last month, and I'm still not sure if I'm ready to talk about it. But I have to get this out because I can't sleep anymore. I can't eat properly. And every time the sun goes down, I feel this overwhelming sense of dread that makes my entire body tense up like I'm waiting for something terrible to happen. My name is Sarah. I'm 26 years old, and for 30 days straight, I was stalked by something that I can only describe as a vampire. And I know how that sounds. I know you're probably thinking I'm crazy or making this up for attention, but I have proof. I have photographs. I have video footage, and I have the scars to prove that what happened to me was real. This started on October 1st, exactly 1 month ago, and it ended on October 30th, the night before Halloween. And I want to tell you everything from the beginning, because every single detail matters. Every single moment of those 30 days was a descent into absolute terror that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I live in a small apartment in Seattle, on the third floor of an old building that was built sometime in the 1920s, and I've always loved this place because it has character. You know, those old wooden floors that creak when you walk on them, the original crown molding, the big windows that let in so much natural light during the day. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my time at home, sitting at my desk, working on projects for various clients, and I've always enjoyed the solitude, the quiet, the ability to make my own schedule and work whenever inspiration strikes. But after what happened, I can't stand being alone anymore. I can't stand the silence, and I've been staying with my sister across town because I'm too afraid to go back to my apartment, too afraid to be alone with my thoughts and the memories of what I experienced. It started on a Tuesday evening, around 8 o'clock, and I remember it was raining, that typical Seattle drizzle that makes everything look gray and dreary. I had just finished working on a logo design for a coffee shop in Portland, and I was feeling pretty good about it, satisfied with the work I'd done, and I decided to treat myself to some takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant down the street. I threw on my raincoat, grabbed my umbrella, and headed out into the wet evening, and the streets were mostly empty because it was a weekday and the weather wasn't great, just a few cars passing by, their headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The restaurant was only about 3 blocks away, and I've made this walk hundreds of times, probably thousands of times over the 2 years I've lived in this neighborhood, so I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings, just thinking about what I was going to order, wondering if I should get the pad thai or try something new. That's when I first felt it, that sensation of being watched. You know that feeling, when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you just know that someone's eyes are on you even though you can't see them. I stopped walking and turned around, scanning the street behind me, but there was nobody there, just empty sidewalks and parked cars, and the rain coming down in a steady rhythm. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd been watching too many horror movies lately, and I kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. It actually got stronger, more intense, like there were invisible fingers pressing against my spine, urging me to turn around to look, to see what was watching me. When I got to the restaurant, I ordered my usual pad thai with extra peanuts and a Thai iced tea, and while I was waiting for my food, I stood by the window, looking out at the street, and that's when I saw him for the first time. He was standing across the street, partially hidden in the shadows between two buildings, and he was staring directly at me, not even trying to hide the fact that he was watching. I couldn't make out many details because of the distance and the rain and the darkness, but I could see that he was tall, very tall, probably over 6 feet, and he was wearing a long black coat that went down to his knees, and his face was pale, unnaturally pale, like he'd never seen the sun in his entire life. Our eyes met, and I felt this jolt of fear run through my entire body, this primal instinct telling me to run, to get away, to hide, but I was frozen, completely paralyzed by the intensity of his gaze. His eyes were dark, so dark they looked almost black, and even from across the street, I could feel the weight of his stare, the way he was looking at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, like he could see right through me, past my skin and bones, straight into my soul. The woman at the counter called my name, breaking the spell, and I grabbed my food and practically ran out of the restaurant, not even bothering to check if he was still there, just wanting to get home as quickly as possible. I walked fast, almost jogging, clutching my takeout bag against my chest, and I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, but I didn't see him following me, didn't see anyone on the street at all. When I got back to my building, I fumbled with my key, my hands shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the lock, and I rushed inside and ran up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, slamming the door behind me and locking it, the deadbolt and the chain, and then I just stood there in my entryway, breathing hard, trying to calm down, telling myself that I was overreacting, that it was just some random guy on the street who happened to be looking in my direction, but I couldn't shake the image of his face, those dark eyes, that pale skin, the way he'd been standing so perfectly still in the rain, like he didn't even feel it. I forced myself to eat my dinner, but I'd lost my appetite, and the food tasted like cardboard in my mouth. I tried to work on some projects, tried to distract myself with Netflix, tried to read a book, but nothing could take my mind off what had happened, and every time I looked at my windows, I half expected to see him standing out there, staring up at my apartment, waiting. That night I barely slept, tossing and turning, waking up every hour or so, convinced I'd heard something, a scratching at the window, footsteps in the hallway, breathing that wasn't my own. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted, drained, like I hadn't slept at all, and I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat at my desk, trying to focus on work, trying to convince myself that the previous night had been nothing, just my imagination running wild, just stress, and too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But then it happened again that night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Every single evening, as soon as the sun started to set, I would feel that sensation of being watched, and when I looked out my window, I would see him standing across the street, always in the same spot, always wearing that long black coat, always staring up at my apartment with those dark, penetrating eyes. I started keeping my curtains closed, but somehow I knew he was still there, still watching, still waiting for something, and the feeling of being observed never went away. It just intensified, growing stronger with each passing night. On the 4th night, I decided to take action, to do something instead of just cowering in my apartment, like a frightened animal. I called the police, told them there was a man who'd been standing outside my building for the past several nights, watching my window, and they said they'd send someone to check it out. I watched from behind my curtains as a patrol car pulled up about 20 minutes later, and the 2 officers got out and looked around, but by then he was gone, vanished like he'd never been there at all, and the officers walked around the area for a few minutes before getting back in their car and driving away. I called them again the next night, and the night after that, but the same thing kept happening. He would disappear before they arrived, and I could tell from the tone of the officer's voice on the phone that they were starting to think I was wasting their time, that I was just some paranoid woman seeing threats that didn't exist. So I decided to document it myself, to gather evidence to prove that I wasn't crazy, that there really was someone stalking me. I set up my phone on a tripod by the window, angled it down toward the street, and started recording every evening, and that's when I got my first real proof that this was actually happening. The video quality isn't great, because it was dark and the street lights in my neighborhood aren't very bright, but you can clearly see him standing there, motionless, his face tilted up toward my window, and he stays there for hours, not moving, not checking his phone, not looking around, just staring. I watched the footage back and timed it, and on the fifth night he stood there for 4 hours and 17 minutes, without moving even once, not even to shift his weight or adjust his coat, and that's not normal. That's not human behavior. No person can stand perfectly still for that long without moving. I showed the video to my friends, sent it to my sister, posted it on a local community forum, asking if anyone else had seen this man, and the responses I got were disturbing. 3 other women, who lived within a 5-block radius of my apartment, said they'd noticed the same man, or someone matching his description, standing outside their buildings at night, always watching, always still, always dressed in that same long black coat. One woman said she'd seen him for 2 weeks before she moved out of the neighborhood, too scared to stay. Another said she'd called the police so many times they'd threatened to cite her for making false reports. By the end of the first week I was terrified, barely sleeping, barely eating, jumping at every sound, checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times every night. I bought pepper spray, a baseball bat, and I even looked into getting a gun, though I'd never owned one before and the idea made me uncomfortable. My work suffered. I was missing deadlines, losing clients, but I couldn't focus on anything except surviving, except making it through each night without something terrible happening. On the 8th night, something changed. I was sitting at my desk, trying to work on a website design that was already 3 days overdue, when I heard a sound at my window, a soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. There's no fire escape outside my window, no way for someone to reach it without a ladder. So I told myself it must be a bird, or a branch from a nearby tree, even though I knew there were no trees close enough to touch my building. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause, and I sat frozen at my desk, too afraid to look, too afraid to move, just listening to that sound, and feeling my heart pound so hard I thought it might break through my rib cage. Finally, I forced myself to stand up, to walk over to the window, to pull back the curtain just a little bit, and when I looked out, I saw him, not on the street where he usually stood, but right outside my window, somehow clinging to the side of the building, his pale face pressed against the glass, those dark eyes staring directly into mine, and his lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, but looked more like a grimace, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp, too long. I screamed and jumped back, tripping over my chair and falling hard onto the floor, and by the time I scrambled back to my feet and looked at the window again, he was gone, just like that, vanished, and I was left wondering if I'd actually seen what I thought I'd seen, or if my mind was finally starting to crack under the pressure. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, clutching the baseball bat, watching the windows, waiting for him to come back, but he didn't, at least not that I could see. When morning came, I called my sister and told her everything, and she begged me to come stay with her, said I could sleep on her couch for as long as I needed, but I refused, told her I wasn't going to let this person, this thing, drive me out of my own home. I regret that decision now. I regret it so much, because if I'd left then, if I'd gone to my sister's house on the 8th day, maybe the rest of this wouldn't have happened. Maybe I could have avoided what came next. The 9th night was quiet, no sign of him on the street, no tapping at the window, nothing, and I started to hope that maybe it was over, maybe he'd gotten bored and moved on to someone else. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I could still feel him out there somewhere, watching, waiting, planning something. The 10th night was the same, quiet, peaceful almost, and I actually managed to sleep for a few hours, the first real sleep I'd gotten in over a week, but I woke up around 3 in the morning with that feeling again, that certainty that I was being watched, and when I opened my eyes I saw a shadow on my ceiling, a human-shaped shadow that shouldn't have been there because I sleep with blackout curtains, and there's no light source in my room that could cast a shadow like that. I turned on my bedside lamp, and the shadow disappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my room, standing over my bed, watching me sleep, and when I got up to check the locks on my doors and windows, everything was still secure, still locked, from the inside, but somehow I knew he'd been there. I could feel it, could smell something strange in the air, something metallic and sweet at the same time, like copper and roses mixed together. The 11th night, I decided to stay awake, to catch him in the act, to prove once and for all that this was really happening. I set up my phone to record my bedroom, positioned it on my dresser, facing the bed, and I lay there in the darkness, eyes wide open. Wait, hours passed, and nothing happened, and I started to drift off, despite my best efforts to stay alert, my eyelids getting heavy, my breathing slowing down, and just as I was on the edge of sleep, I heard it, the sound of breathing that wasn't my own, slow and steady, coming from somewhere in my room. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, listening to that breathing get closer, closer, until I could feel someone standing right next to my bed, could feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on me, could smell that strange metallic sweet scent getting stronger. My heart was racing, but I kept my eyes closed, kept my breathing even, and then I felt it, cold fingers touching my face, tracing the line of my jaw, brushing against my neck, and it took everything I had not to scream, not to jump up and run, because I needed to catch this on video, needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The fingers moved from my neck, down to my collarbone, and the touch was so cold it almost burned, like being touched by something made of ice. And then I felt breath on my neck, cold breath, that smelled like earth and decay, and I heard a voice, barely a whisper, saying my name, Sarah, and it wasn't a question, it was a statement, like he was confirming something he already knew, and the way he said it made my blood run cold, because there was something hungry in his voice, something dark and ancient and wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes and sat up fast, reaching for the lamp, but he was already gone. The room was empty. There was no one there, just me and the darkness, and that lingering smell. I grabbed my phone and played back the video, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device, and what I saw on that screen confirmed my worst fears and introduced me to a horror I'd never imagined possible. The video shows me lying in bed, apparently asleep, and for about 40 minutes, nothing happens, just me breathing, occasionally shifting position, normal sleep behavior. But then, at the 43-minute mark, something appears in the frame, not walking in from the door or climbing through the window, but just materializing next to my bed like smoke condensing into a solid form. The figure is tall and thin, wearing that long black coat, and even in the low light from the street filtering through my curtains I can see how pale his skin is, how dark his eyes are, how his movements are too smooth, too fluid, not quite human. He stands there for several minutes, just watching me sleep, his head tilted slightly to one side like a curious animal, studying something it doesn't quite understand, and then he reaches out and touches my face, exactly as I'd felt it, his fingers tracing my jaw, moving down to my neck, and I can see in the video how my body responds even in sleep, how I flinch slightly at his touch, how my breathing changes, becoming faster, shallower. He leans down, bringing his face close to my neck, and his mouth opens, and I can see his teeth, long and sharp and definitely not human. And for a moment I think he's going to bite me, going to sink those teeth into my throat, but instead he just breathes in deeply, like he's smelling me, savoring my scent. Then he whispers my name. I can see his lips moving in the video, even though the audio barely picks it up. And that's when I sit up in the video. That's when he vanishes, not walking away or running, but literally disappearing, fading away like mist in the morning sun, and I'm left alone in the frame, grabbing for my phone, looking around the empty room with wide, terrified eyes. I must have watched that video 100 times that night, zooming in on his face, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to find a rational explanation for how someone could just appear and disappear like that. But there was no rational explanation. There was only the impossible truth staring back at me from my phone screen. This wasn't a person. This wasn't a stalker in the traditional sense. This was something else, something supernatural, something that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. I spent the rest of that night researching vampires, reading everything I could find, old folklore, modern interpretations, supposed real sightings, and the more I read, the more convinced I became that this was what I was dealing with. Everything matched: the pale skin, the dark eyes, the ability to appear and disappear, the fascination with watching people sleep, the cold touch, the sharp teeth, the nocturnal habits. All of it lined up perfectly with descriptions of vampires from cultures all around the world. But knowing what he was didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made things worse. Because if vampires were real, then what else was real? What other monsters were hiding in the shadows? And more importantly, what did this vampire want with me? Why had he chosen me? And what was going to happen when he decided that watching wasn't enough anymore? The 12th night, I didn't even pretend to work. I couldn't focus on anything except survival, except figuring out how to protect myself from something that could walk through walls or materialize out of thin air. I went to a metaphysical shop downtown, the kind of place I'd always dismissed as superstitious nonsense, and I bought garlic, holy water, silver jewelry, a cross, everything the stories said would repel vampires. And I hung garlic around my windows, put the cross above my bed, wore a silver chain around my neck, sprinkled the holy water around my apartment, and I felt ridiculous doing it, but I was desperate, willing to try anything. That night he came again. I could feel him in my apartment, even though I couldn't see him, could feel his presence, like a cold spot in the air, and I heard him laughing, a soft amused sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then he appeared right in front of me, materializing in the middle of my living room, and he looked at all my protections, the garlic, the cross, the holy water, and he smiled, that same disturbing smile I'd seen through my window, and he said in that cold, ancient voice that none of it would work, that those were just stories, just myths, that real vampires weren't afraid of garlic, or crosses, or holy water, and the only thing that could truly harm him was sunlight. And even that wouldn't kill him, just weaken him, make him vulnerable. He told me his name was Adrian, that he'd been walking this earth for over 300 years, that he'd been watching me for much longer than 30 days, that he'd seen me from afar and become fascinated by me, by something in my blood, something in my essence, that called to him like a siren song, and he'd finally decided to reveal himself, to let me know I'd been chosen, that I should feel honored, because he'd gone centuries without selecting anyone, without feeling this pull toward another being. I asked him what he wanted from me, my voice shaking, my whole body trembling, and he said he wanted many things, that he wanted to watch, to learn everything about me, to eventually turn me into what he was, to make me his companion for eternity. And the way he said it, like it was inevitable, like I had no choice in the matter, made me feel like my entire future had just been ripped away and replaced with something dark and terrible. I told him no, told him to leave me alone, to find someone else, and he just laughed again and said it didn't work that way, that I'd been chosen, and there was no unchoose, that I could fight it if I wanted, but eventually I would give in, eventually I would accept my fate, because humans always did, they always broke, eventually. The mind could only take so much fear, so much stress, so much terror, before it cracked, and accepted whatever offered relief. Then he vanished again, leaving me alone, in my living room, surrounded by useless protections, feeling more hopeless than I'd ever felt in my life. I called my sister that night, finally took her up on her offer to come stay with her, and I packed a bag and left my apartment at 2 in the morning, practically running to my car, driving across town with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, constantly checking my rearview mirror to see if he was following me. But I didn't see him, didn't see anything unusual, just empty streets and traffic lights and the occasional other car. My sister lived in a different neighborhood, a newer building with better security, a doorman, cameras, the works, and I thought maybe I'd be safe there. Maybe he wouldn't be able to find me or wouldn't bother looking. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. The 13th night, despite being in a completely different location, he found me, appeared in my sister's guest room, while I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, and he seemed amused by my attempt to escape, said I couldn't run from him, couldn't hide, that he would always know where I was, could always feel like we were connected now, linked in some way I didn't understand. My sister heard me scream, and came running in, turning on the lights, but of course by then, he was gone, and I had to explain what had happened, had to show her the videos on my phone, had to watch her face go from concern to disbelief to horror, as she realized I was telling the truth, that something impossible was happening, that her little sister was being stalked by a vampire. She wanted to go to the police again, wanted to show them the videos, but I knew it wouldn't help, knew they'd either think the videos were fake, or they wouldn't know what to do about it, even if they believed the videos were real, because what can the police do against something that can appear and disappear at will? Something that's not bound by the normal rules of reality, something that's been alive for 300 years, and has probably evaded capture countless times before. Instead, we started researching together, spending hours online, looking for information about real vampires, looking for people who'd had similar experience, looking for any kind of solution or escape, and we found stories, dozens of stories, hundreds of stories, from all over the world, from people who claimed to have encountered vampires, who'd been stalked or attacked or turned, and while some of the stories were obviously clearly written by attention seekers or creative writers, others had a ring of truth to them, a desperate sincerity that couldn't be faked. We found one story in particular from a woman in New Orleans, who'd been in a similar situation, who'd been stalked by a vampire for weeks, and she'd finally escaped by finding a witch, a real practitioner of magic, who'd created a protection spell, a ward that kept the vampire away, and the woman included contact information for the witch, a phone number and an email address. And my sister and I looked at each other, and decided we had nothing to lose, that we were willing to try anything at this point. I sent an email that night, explaining my situation as clearly and concisely as possible, half expecting to get no response or to get some kind of scam reply, asking for money. But the next morning, there was a response in my inbox, a short message from someone named Madame Laveau, saying she believed me, saying she'd helped others in similar situations, saying she could help me too if I was willing to come to New Orleans, and she included her address, and her rates, which were surprisingly reasonable, a few $100s for a consultation and spell work, far less than I'd expected. My sister bought me a plane ticket that same day, helped me pack, drove me to the airport, and I flew to New Orleans, on the 15th day, carrying nothing but a small suitcase, and a desperate hope that this Madame Laveau could actually help me, that she wasn't just another charlatan taking advantage of desperate people. New Orleans was hot and humid even in October, a stark contrast to Seattle's cool drizzle, and I took a taxi from the airport to the address Madame Laveau had given me, a small house in the Garden District, painted purple with white trim, wind chimes hanging from the porch, and when I knocked on the door it opened almost immediately, like she'd been waiting for me, expecting me. Madame Laveau was not what I expected. I'd pictured some old woman in elaborate robes, with lots of jewelry and dramatic makeup, but she was probably only in her 40s, wearing jeans and a simple white shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she looked at me with kind eyes, and said she could see it on me, could see the mark he'd left, could see the connection he'd created, and she asked me to come in, to sit down, to tell her everything from the beginning. I spent 2 hours telling her my story, showing her the videos on my phone, answering her questions about Adrian, about what he'd said to me, how he behaved, what he wanted, and she listened carefully, taking notes, occasionally asking me to clarify something or provide more detail. And when I was finished, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment, thinking, and I waited, barely breathing, hoping she would say she could help, that there was a solution. Finally, she spoke, told me that what I was dealing with was indeed a vampire, a very old and very powerful one, based on my description, and that I was in serious danger. Because vampires like Adrian didn't give up easily, didn't lose interest. They were obsessive by nature. Immortality gave them all the time in the world to pursue what they wanted, and what Adrian wanted was me. But she said there was hope. There were ways to break the connection he'd formed, ways to hide myself from him, to make it so he couldn't find me anymore, couldn't sense me, and it would require a complex spell, a ritual that would take several days to prepare, and it wouldn't be pleasant for me, would require me to give up something of myself, a sacrifice of sorts, but it would work. She was confident it would work. I her what kind of sacrifice, and she said blood, hair, tears, things that carried my essence, and I would have to burn them as part of the ritual, symbolically severing the connection between myself and Adrian, and I would also have to wear a specific talisman she would create, wear it always, never take it off, because it would act as a shield, making me invisible to supernatural senses, hiding me from creatures like Adrian, who tracked their prey through means beyond the normal 5 senses. I agreed immediately, told her I would do whatever it took, and she got to work that same day, gathering ingredients, drawing symbols on the floor of a small room in the back of her house, preparing for the ritual that would hopefully set me free. But I'd made a mistake, a terrible mistake, because I'd underestimated Adrian, underestimated how connected we already were, how much he could sense about me. And that night, the 15th night, while I was sleeping in a small hotel near Madame Laveau's house, he found me again, appeared in my room looking different than before, looking angry, his eyes burning with a rage I hadn't seen before, and he grabbed me by the throat, lifted me off the bed with one hand, his grip like iron, cutting off my air, and he asked me what I thought I was doing. Did I really think I could escape him? Did I really think some witch could break what he'd created? And his voice was like ice, like death, and I genuinely thought in that moment that he was going to kill me, that I'd pushed him too far. But then he dropped me, let me fall back onto the bed, gasping for air, cough, my throat bruised and painful, and he said he'd decided to accelerate his timeline, that he'd been planning to court me for months, to slowly win me over, to make me want the transformation he was offering. But I'd forced his hand, forced him to take action sooner than he'd want, and tomorrow night, the 16th night, he would come for me again, and he would turn me whether I wanted it or not, would drain me to the point of death, and then feed me his blood, and I would rise as one of his kind, and we would be together forever, and there was nothing I could do to stop. He vanished, after that, leaving me alone, and terrified and in pain, and I called Madame Laveau immediately, told her what had happened, and she said we had to do the ritual now, tonight, that we couldn't wait, that if what Adrian said was true, then we had less than 24 hours before he would try to turn me, and once that process started it was irreversible. I would become a vampire and there would be no going back. I went to her house at 3 in the morning. She'd been up prepared. The ritual space was ready, candles lit, symbols drawn, ingredients laid out, and she walked me through what would happen, how I would need to cut my palm and let my blood drip onto a special cloth, how I would need to cut a lock of my hair and burn it in a brass bowl, how I would need to cry and let my tears fall into a chalice of consecrated water, and how she would combine all of these things and speak words in a language I didn't understand, old words, powerful words, and if it worked, if we did everything correct, the connection between me and Adrian would be broken, severed completely, and he wouldn't be able to find me anymore. We started the ritual at 3:30 in the morning, and it took over 2 hours, 2 hours of chanting and burning, and bleeding and crying, and I felt something change around the midway point, felt something break inside me, like a cord being cut, like a weight being lifted, and I knew it was working, knew the connection was breaking, and I felt hope for the first time in 2 weeks, genuine hope, that maybe I would survive this, maybe I would get my life back. When it was over, when Madame Laveau had completed the final incantation and extinguished the candles, she gave me the talisman she'd created, a small leather pouch containing herbs and crystals, and a piece of paper with symbols written on it, all tied up with red thread, and she told me to wear it around my neck, under my clothes where it would rest against my heart, and to never ever take it off, not to shower, not to sleep, never, because the moment I removed it, the protection would break, and Adrian would be able to find me again. I put it on immediately, felt the small weight of it against my chest, and Madame Laveau said, I should leave New Orleans right away, should go back to Seattle, or go somewhere else entirely, somewhere Adrian wouldn't think to look for me, and I should change my routine, change my habit, make it even harder for him to find me, even if the spell failed, even if he somehow broke through the protection. I took her advice, flew back to Seattle that same day, but I didn't go to my apartment or to my sister's house. Instead, I rented a short-term Airbnb in a completely different part of the city, a small studio apartment in a building with good security, and I told only my sister where I was, swore her to secrecy, made her promise not to tell anyone else, not our parents, not our friends, no. The 16th night came and went, and Adrian didn't appear, and I spent the entire night awake, waiting, expecting him to materialize at any moment, but he never did, and when dawn finally broke, I allowed myself to believe that maybe the ritual had worked, maybe I was finally free. The 17th, 18th and 19th nights were the same, no sign of him, no feeling of being watched, no cold presence in my room, just normal peaceful nights, and I started to relax, started to think about rebuilding my life, about going back to work, about eventually returning to my own apartment. But on the 20th night, something changed. I started having dreams about him, vivid, intense dreams, where he was calling to me, telling me to remove the talisman, telling me it was hurting him, hurting us both, preventing us from being together the way we were meant to be. And in the dreams his voice was so persuasive, so convincing, and I would wake up with my hand on the talisman, about to take it off, and I had to force myself to let go, had to remind myself that it was just a dream, just him trying to manipulate me. The dreams got worse over the next several nights, more frequent, more intense, and I started seeing him everywhere, catching glimpses of him in crowds, seeing his face in windows, hearing his voice in the wind, and I didn't know if it was real or if I was losing my mind, if the stress and fear and lack of sleep were finally causing me to crack. On the 25th night, I woke up screaming, convinced he was in the room with me, convinced I could smell that metallic sweet scent, could feel his cold breath on my neck. But when I turned on the lights, the room was empty. I was alone, and I realized I couldn't keep living like this, couldn't spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows, afraid to sleep, afraid to dream, constantly looking over my shoulder. I called Madame Laveau again, told her about the dreams, asked her if it was normal, if it meant the spell was failing, and she said no, the spell was holding, but Adrian was strong, stronger than most vampires she'd dealt with, and he was trying to break through, trying to reach me through my subconscious, and I needed to strengthen my mental defenses, needed to practice meditation and visualization, needed to build walls in my mind that he couldn't penetrate. She walked me through some techniques over the phone, taught me how to create a mental shield, how to visualize a barrier of white light surrounding me, protecting me, and she said to practice this every day, multiple times a day, until it became second nature, until my mind automatically rejected any attempt at intrusion. I did what she said, practiced the visualization constantly, and slowly, gradually, the dreams started to lessen, started to lose their power over me, and by the 28th night, they'd stopped completely, and I felt like maybe, finally, I'd won, maybe I'd actually escaped him. The 29th night, I decided to go out, to leave my Airbnb, and go to a coffee shop, to try to feel normal again, to be around people, and noise and life, and it felt good, felt liberating, and I stayed out until late, until almost midnight, and when I walked back to my building, I felt confident, felt strong, felt like I'd reclaimed my life. But when I got to my door, I found something that made my blood run cold, a single black rose lying on my door, and attached to it was a note written in elegant handwriting that simply said soon, and I knew it was from him, knew he'd found me, despite the spell, despite the talisman, despite everything. And the 29 days of hell I'd endured were about to culminate in something terrible. I didn't go inside, didn't even unlock my door, just turned around and ran, left the building, got in my car, and drove to my sister's house. And when I told her what had happened, she immediately called Madame Laveau, put her on speakerphone, and Madame Laveau said something I'll never forget. She said the spell was still working, that Adrian couldn't actually sense me or track me, but he was smart, very smart, and he'd probably been systematically searching every building in Seattle, every hotel, every Airbnb, every apartment, and he'd eventually found me through sheer determination and process of elimination.